operating in Germany from a nerve agent poisoning that was, according to all experts, most likely done by Russia's regime. The court ordering him to prison for more than 2.5 years. And during that hearing, Navalny could be seen making a heart gesture to his wife, Yulia, who was in the room. Earlier today, I spoke to a Russia expert. Her name, Heather Conley. She works for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She studies the Russian regime very closely, Vladimir Putin very closely, and we dived a little deeper into the entire Navalny phenomenon. He's a very powerful opposition leader. As you remember, he was poisoned by Russian agents late last year. He's since recovered, now being sentenced to prison. Here's that conversation right now. I'm being joined right now by Heather Conley. She's a Europe and Russia expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies there in Washington, D.C. Heather, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
As you know, Alexei Navalny, one of Putin's biggest critics and the main opposition leader in Russia, was detained today and sentenced, I believe. Can you kind of go into what he's facing right now?
Yes, today Alexei Navalny was sentenced to prison for at least 2.5 years. It's originally a 3.5-year sentence, but he was given time that he already served in custody. What this is, the charge is that he violated his probation from an earlier charge of money laundering. This was a previous conviction, and the reason that he broke this so-called prohibition was that he, of course, in July of last year was poisoned while he was campaigning before Russian municipal elections this past summer. He was poisoned with a military-grade chemical agent called Novichok. He almost lost his life. He was airlifted from central Russia to Germany, and he was in a coma when the Russian authorities said that he broke his probation because he hadn't called where he was. He was in a coma after suffering at the hands of the regime from a chemical agent. So it was very farcical. But what Alexei Navalny did in returning to Russia after nearly dying on January the 17th, he defied Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime. He looked very courageously at this regime and said, I am coming back to fight for a different future for Russia. And today he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for that courage.
Yeah, I mean, that is just quite stunning, just the nature of the charges themselves, especially he was poisoned, at the hands of Putin's agents, if you will. Is it safe to say, or is it kind of oversimplistic to say that he's a thorn in Putin's side? How threatened does Putin feel by Navalny? How much power does Navalny have among the opposition in Russia?
Well, this is the thing. When Navalny, he certainly has been a thorn in the side of the Russian regime, but quite frankly, he's never directly challenged or threatened Putin's leadership. Putin has such a firm hold over all the security services and the domestic organs of power in Russia. Alexei Navalny is not a threat, but he is a nuisance, and this nuisance has been growing over time. But he's been highlighting the corruption of the regime, and that's really, I think, where we saw a quantum leap. So not only did Alexei Navalny return to Russia, but he returned with a very damning video, which has now been viewed over 106 million times on YouTube. It's called Putin's Palace, and it features allegedly Vladimir Putin's incredibly luxurious palace in southern Russia. Of course, as you think about the Russian people who have had stagnating wages and living standards since 2011, their pensions have been reformed. COVID-19 has been devastating to Russia. So you have at the intersection of people that are very upset that their standard of living has not been improving, conditions are worsening, yet they see highlighting the corruption of the regime. And this is Alexei Navalny's point. He is focusing on corruption in Russia and fighting for a different future. So in the summer, last summer, as Alexei Navalny was campaigning, we were starting to see where his tactics called smart voting were gaining traction. So members of Putin's United Russia Party were losing in these elections. Not a threat, but starting to become a nuisance. And that's, of course, when the Novichok poisoning happened, and it took Navalny out of Russia. And I think the regime thought that he wouldn't have the courage to return, that they got rid of him, but he came back and is more focused than ever in fighting corruption in Russia.
That's right. I mean, that's just a stunning act of courage there. But that other part of the nuisance that you're talking about as well are these protests that we've been seeing for about the past 2 weekends. Kind of give us an explanation on the nature of the protests. Are they similar to the ones we saw against Putin back in 2011? And you know, are they relatively peaceful, or they have turned violent?
So you're absolutely right. The protest movement has been increasing across Russia. This is not just what Alexei Navalny and his foundation have been encouraging to protest against the authorities and corruption, but we've seen a range of protests, again, starting this summer in the Russian Far East, because Moscow very quickly removed a very popular governor in the region. It was due to sort of a controversy with other oligarchs. And they were some of the largest protests we've ever seen. There have been protests about pension reform, environmental and climate change conditions, and the regime has always dealt with those. But what we've seen with Alexei Navalny's return, 2 weekends ago, we saw very large demonstrations. They were not as large as the ones you noted in 2011. In 2011, however, they were concentrated in the major urban areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But these protests in the middle of January, in some areas, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So these protesters are very motivated. But they came out across in the middle of January, in some areas, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So these protesters are very motivated. But they came out across over 100 Russian cities that had never seen protests before since Putin came to power. Young people coming out, the middle class, people that have never protested before. So we do feel something is different here. Protesters are coming out, they're fighting for their future, but in many ways, these protests have no place to go. Vladimir Putin is firmly in control of the security services. And what we've seen over the last 2 weeks is they are cracking down. Over 6,000 protesters are now in jail. Their tactics are extremely harsh. They're closing down major urban centers. They know this is going to be a prolonged fight, and the Russian security services are certainly ready for it.
I want to kind of take us back a little bit. Can you kind of chart Alexei Navalny's course through all of this, you know, starting whenever you want to start, but you know, how did he get his rise to power, if you will, amongst the opposition? You know, I'm sure he used TV and social media, but can we kind of chart his rise?
Yes, I mean, again, he's 44 years old, so a fairly young activist, you know, trying to get a foothold. Again, the regime didn't see Alexei Navalny as much of a challenge, really, until he began to focus when Vladimir Putin returned to the Kremlin in 2012. He began focusing on this corruption issue, calling Putin and the regime thieves and liars. And that message really began to galvanize. He created his anti-corruption foundation, which has offices across Russia. Young people are involved in this. So he created basically a grassroots movement. And so in some ways, he started very small. A nationalistic leader for sure, but now that we see this anti-corruption message taking hold, he has become a very focused and most viable political opposition figure that Russia has seen in some time. Others have tried to create some political opposition space. They've gotten nowhere. Either the Kremlin uses them as sort of Potemkin opposition, but they've co-opted them as systemic opposition. Alexei Navalny has been dogged in his approach to anti-corruption, and he's now gone directly after Vladimir Putin in that regard.
Heather, just looking ahead as well, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Do you think there'll be more, charges, detentions that Navalny will face in the future? Do you think he'll be poisoned again?
Well, we certainly hope he will remain safe in prison. We are mindful of another a young, brave activist that fought against the corruption of the Russian government, Sergei Magnitsky, who tragically died in prison. We have to be very concerned about Alexei Navalny's future health and safety, not only after this previous assassination attempt, but you're asking the right question. So can Alexei Navalny's movement survive their leader being in prison for at least the next 2.5 years, if not longer? I think they have staying power. It's not going to be led by the charismatic voice of Mr. Navalny. I assume they will send him to a faraway penal colony where he will have no access to his social media account, which has been so galvanizing for so many Russians. But this movement will continue. I would anticipate they're going to highlight more corruption in these very, very sophisticated videos. They're not going to let this go. And the Russian regime is going to crack down harder. So the more you crack down on these protesters, the more energy you may give them. But this could be a very long stalemate between a regime that's losing legitimacy and a population that's getting very, very restless.
Heather, last question for you. Let's bring it back home to the U.S. We know last week that President Biden had his first call with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. He brought that up. He brought Navalny's case up to Putin himself in the call, according to the readout from the White House press secretary. Is the Biden administration doing enough to pressure Putin right now?
So they are applying a lot of rhetorical pressure. Secretary of State Tony Blinken just gave a very strong statement demanding the release of Navalny, as well as the thousands of protesters that have been imprisoned just for simply peaceful protest and freedom of assembly. So I imagine that rhetoric will continue. The question is, will the Biden administration take decisive policy action? Will there be more sanctions? Right now, the Biden administration, one of its very first acts was to ask the newly confirmed Director of National Intelligence to begin a comprehensive review of Russia's policy, its potential interference in the 2020 election. Russia has also perpetrated the largest network penetration operation in U.S. history, the SolarWinds hack. So there's both cyber, there's malign influence, there's human rights and rule of law violations. So the Biden administration is going to be very tough on those accounts. At the same time, they want to continue arms control discussions to get us back into some greater strategic stability and predictability as Russia develops new and pretty devastating new weapons that we do need to get a handle on. So it's going to be a very, very difficult account. And the internal situation in Russia is going to make this regime even more challenging to work with.
All right. Heather Conley, the Europe and Russia expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We thank you for joining us here on News Now from Fox tonight.
Thank you.
All right, that was my conversation there with Heather from CSIS there in Washington.